Hello and welcome to the Climate Futures podcast from the Oxford Smith School. My name is Dave Vetter, and throughout this series I'll be speaking to researchers, leaders and thinkers about how we collectively build a future for ourselves on the planet we call home. This requires nothing less than a reimagining of our relationship with the Earth. Today we're talking about city heat. As climate change makes heat waves more frequent and more intense, city dwellers will face increasing health risks from the urban heat island effect, where all those concrete surfaces and infrastructure absorb and radiate that heat. So in our rapidly urbanising world, what can we do to protect lives? Happily, some of our brightest minds are working on that very problem. Joining me today are Radhika Khosla, Associate Professor at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment and Research Director of the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development at the University of Oxford. Hi Radhika, where are you joining us from today?
I'm here in Oxford.
Alongside Radhika, I'd like to welcome Angélica Ospina, a civil and environmental engineer and director of the Colombia Green Building Council. Angélica, welcome. Whereabouts are you?
Hello, Dave. I'm here in Bogota.
Okay, I'd like to begin with Radhika, and I'd like to turn to you to frame this burning issue. Could you introduce us to your work and tell us a bit more about the problems that you're trying to solve?
Happy to do that, Dave. So my work focuses on extreme heat and the global energy demand to meet rising extreme heat or cooling demand. And overall, I'm interested in how societies in transition manage the tension between growing energy needs for their development and for their quality of life, and also protecting the environment. Now, extreme heat is a really interesting, troubling, but also fascinating mix of that problem, because we're at a stage in the history of the planet where the number of extreme heat events are growing in an unprecedented manner in their intensity, in their frequency, and in their duration. Extreme heat kills more than any other extreme weather event, so much more than flooding, droughts, wildfires, etc. It often doesn't have the kind of aftermath of destruction that a lot of the other extreme weather events have, but actually it's killing more people than any other extreme weather events. And my work is to be able to understand the predictability of rising extreme heat, but also the adaptation and mitigation of it. How do we protect people, communities, infrastructure, countries from this rising change? And what are we going to do about global cooling energy demand? We know it's going to keep getting hotter. We're going to need more and more cooling, especially from air conditioning, to manage that heat. But how is that cooling demand going to be provided, and how is the grid going to cope with that? So those are some of the questions that I'm grappling with.
Thanks very much indeed, Radhika. So in your view and right now, what are the biggest challenges that we're facing with regard to urban heat?
We have a number of challenges on the table. Often the entry point to the urban heat challenges are that of health. So 3/4 of the global population is already at risk of health complications due to extreme heat. Another real challenge of urban heat is that of the workforce, because we have a lot of people who are exposed to extreme heat, and this comes in the way of their productivity. So the International Labour Organization put out a report recently that said over 70% of the global workforce, which is 2.4 billion people, are now at risk of extreme heat, and it's going to result in about 22.8 million injuries and about 18,000 deaths annually just among workers. Now, this is sort of, some of the more health and economic aspects of rising extreme heat. There's also the energy question, like I was talking about before, which is that the rise in air conditioning from rising extreme heat is so significant that the International Energy Agency has said that we will be buying and using 10 new air conditioners every second for the next 30 years. So that's an equivalent of 10 new air conditioners every second for the next 30 years. And that poses huge challenges on urban grids and urban energy demand, and on national grids, because I'm not sure that our electricity systems are capable of managing the load that is coming upon them very quickly.
That's an incredible statistic. 10 new air conditioners every second for the next 30 years. And as you say, 2.4 billion people at risk from extreme heat. And that's quite a chunk of the global population. So let's turn to Angélica, who is an engineer who's now working in policy in Colombia on this issue and related issues. Angélica, you get to put into practice some of the understanding developed by heat researchers. Could you introduce your work to us and tell us a bit about the heat challenges you're facing in Colombia?
Yes, Dave. Here at Colombia Green Building Council, we work to move the industry and the different stakeholders towards sustainability and regeneration. That's the main purpose of our work. We work in the housing industry, the buildings industry, but also in terms of the urban development, infrastructure. And what we do is to work in terms of public policy to try to get the policy to involve like this different situation, also in terms of education, in terms of finance, tools, and to articulate different stakeholders. And I think that's the most important thing that we do at the council. Currently, when you see a country like Colombia, we're very vulnerable to climate change. So that's one of the key points that we have. We are not like huge producers of gas house emissions. However, we're very vulnerable to climate change. So we need to implement a lot of different strategies in terms of adaptation. When we see the problem of climate change and adaptation here in Colombia, we face heat, I think that's something that is very important for us, especially in some cities like Barranquilla, Cartagena, that are in the coast of the country. And we also face other problems, other important problems in terms of adaptation related to water. That's something that is very important for us as well. So that's something that we also need to, to combine, to merge together, to work, and also we have floods, we have like very dry seasons, and then we're experiencing in the last couple of years like extreme heat in these specific cities. So what we are doing is work at the different levels. In one hand, work with the government because we need like public policy that includes these issues, that understand what is happening at this point. Also to have like urban development projects as we have in Medellin, Barranquilla, that are taking care of the heat problem at the urban scale, because I think that's something that is very important for us. And also we're working with the different practitioners, engineers, architects, to work at the building or at the project scale. So that's what we're trying to now, is to combine the work at both scales and to integrate the solutions.
Thank you, Angélica. As you say, Colombia especially vulnerable to climate change. Now, most people listening and viewing won't know much about how you engineer a city to deal with heat. Would you be able to introduce us to a few key principles that architects and engineers and policy people are looking at and thinking about to try and make these heat events less harmful?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing in the different cities is to understand like the ecological structure of the city. I think that's one of the main points, and to try to understand that in terms of the impact that has received. I think something is very important, and so there is to understand how can regenerate that ecological structure of the city. Also to try to understand the water flows and how to also activate those water flows So I think the two most important like strategies that we are using at this point is to use like sustainable drainage systems, and also to use like natural based solutions to, and as I said, to understand how to use this at the urban scale, but also at the building or at the project scale.
Thank you. And in fact, could you talk a little bit more about how nature-based solutions can help counteract these major heat events?
I think that one of the, and I guess like Radhika is very expert in this. Something that is very important is the heat island effect that we have, at this point, and is how the cities are getting hotter or heater, than the surroundings, and it's because of the different materials that we're using, because of the different activities that we are conducting in the cities. So with these nature-based solutions, what we're trying to is to target two main objectives. One is first is related to biodiversity. Is how we really are able to to have the different species and everything to interact in the cities and not move everything outside the city, but also try to control that heat island effect. So as long as we bring like more nature into the cities, we green our environments, we can deal with both objectives.
Right now, I think there's quite a few misconceptions out there in the public about extreme heat events. So I'd like to ask about that. And maybe, Angelica, have you identified any misconceptions around urban heat events in your work? And what do you say to counter those misconceptions?
I think, and it's not only in terms of heat, but in terms of adaptation. I think the largest misconception that I find still today, is that everyone thinks that the climate change is a future problem. It's not a problem today. So when we see, like all these different definitions of sustainable development and everything, they always talk about the future, and I think what we're trying to now is to get, like everyone aware that the climate change issue is a problem of today. It's something that we need to handle today, and adaptation is something that we need to move very fast, especially in a country like Colombia is very vulnerable. So we have to stop thinking that there is something that is going to to happen in the future. It's something that is happening now. It's something that we need to address today.
Some very important considerations. And as you say, it's with us now, and countries like Colombia are getting hit harder than countries in the global north, where we are in the UK. I'd like to ask the same to Radhika. Radhika, do you have any heat tropes or misconceptions you'd like to address here?
Yeah, I think, when we think about heat, especially in temperate climates like the UK, we're all very excited that it's warm. Our imagery is very much about ice cream and being on the beach, and and it just seems like such a good thing, which it is. I mean, the warmth is great. Don't get me wrong. I love the warmth. But you just want to be outside and be as exposed to it as possible. I think the misconception is that the kind of heat we're seeing now is not like anything we've seen before. It is just so much more intense. And so actually those same routines and habits are no longer serving us. If there's this project that looks at the imagery that people in the UK think about when they think about heat, and it's all of this, sort of ice creams and swimming pools. But then when asked about their lived experience of those same temperatures, it's completely different. It's, feeling suffocated, not feeling well, having sort of heart issues, just feeling exhausted, not being able to sleep, not being productive. And I think there's, that mismatch is part of the misconception that actually all of this all of this sort of, very hot day and very hot days and conditions are somehow pleasurable. Unfortunately, we're at thresholds where that's no longer true.
Well, thank you. Coming from a media background here in the UK, it always makes me cringe to see whenever there's a heat wave in the UK, the national newspapers like to put pictures of people on the beach enjoying themselves. And I think we really need to move away from that in light of the harms that extreme heat is causing increasingly. Now, connected to the climate crisis is a second equally emergent crisis, that of biodiversity decline globally. This October, the COP16 conference is getting together in Colombia to discuss this exact issue. I'd like to ask Angélica, how are these issues connected in terms of heat events, and what can planners do to tackle potentially both?
Yes, Dave. I think in the past in the world, like biodiversity and climate change have been handled like separate things, but they really come together when you look for the solutions for that. So when we talk about nature-based solutions, things that we can do from the built environment are really connected to both. One great example of this is, for instance, the Medellin corridor that we have here in Colombia. It's a urban development plan for the city where you bring together water, but also nature-based solutions, like everything to start, like decreasing heat, but also to bringing again like different species that are not part of the city any longer. And the outcome that they have at this point is great, in terms of public space, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate change. So I think we need to start thinking as planners, as engineers, in complete solutions, that help us tackle like all these different troubles or problems that we have now in the world.
So thinking about that, Radhika, you've specialized in heat research in South Asia and particularly in India. Are the problems that Angélica is describing in Colombia similar to those that you've seen in your work? And maybe could you talk about the parallels and where these different regions diverge?
I think there are loads of parallels when we're looking at countries that are, in various stages of development, but where development is the primary priority. And like Angélica was saying, it's challenging to work on heat or on any environmental or climate change related issue when you have multiple objectives that policymakers are focused on. And these multiple objectives are often much more immediate. So things like providing shelter, providing jobs, providing infrastructure, providing livelihoods, addressing crime. Often these things are competing with the attention of policymakers and of different stakeholders along with addressing climate change or heat adaptation. And I think that's something that we all have to grapple with when we're working in contexts where development is so fundamental. But I think the way through that is also similar to what Angélica is saying, because it's really about bringing different stakeholders who have different priorities together and working collectively on finding pathways where the synergies between different tasks are aligned. How can we get real estate developers in the room and have them work with policymakers to implement, say, a built environment and construct a built environment that is much more conducive to passive cooling techniques, which means that you would have a really comfortable thermal environment, a comfortable working space and a living space in a building without using too much electricity or energy to be able to provide it. So I think that challenge of working across difficult stakeholders is one that is shared and I would say that that's shared in most contexts. And then beyond that, I think some of the things that I see in India, but also equally in the UK when we're looking at heat adaptation is how do we work through coordination between different policy departments, because heat is not, it's not an issue that sits only in the weather department. It requires coordinating with the health department. It requires coordinating, often with other forms of policy line ministries as well. So coordination remains key. Also, do we have the capacity to be able to manage this? Because already, governments and other non-state actors are tasked with so many different issues, and this is yet one more thing for us to now have to grapple with, and having the capacity to be able to respond to heat and be prepared for it is really fundamental. And then finally, I'd say, do we have the ability to communicate, and are we communicating well about impending heat disasters? Because communication is such a key part of being able to prevent the kind of morbidities and mortalities that we see from heat. Heat is it's difficult because it's so widespread, it's growing very intensely around the world. But on the flip side, often a lot of the damage from it is preventable. But that does require this nexus of coordination, of communication and capacity.
Thank you, Radhika. In fact, if I can draw out one of the issues here, when I hear people talking about urban heat, we're hearing a lot more about passive cooling, and this, I think, is an interesting area. Could you describe a couple of these techniques?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Well, I'll start with a very simple one, which is shading. Shading is such an easy way, but it makes a huge difference. I don't know if you've noticed when you're walking down the street, especially when it's a road, like made of tar, which is very black, emitting a lot of radiation that's hitting it, and just creating a warm microclimate because of that. An area that's shaded and not shaded is often a few degrees cooler. And it's just the difference of having direct sunlight hit a particular spot and not hit a particular spot. And if we look back at many countries in Southern Europe that have dealt with heat for a long time, or countries in the South Asian region that have lived with heat for a long time, shading is so fundamental, whether that is external shutters on buildings, whether that's using internal shutters or curtains in buildings, whether it's orienting the home to be able to make sure that it has less solar gain. There's the use of shading is really, really easy and very effective in preventing heat from building up inside a building or even in outdoor spaces. Often, trees are so powerful because they allow you to stay cooler in urban environments, and that's also one of the challenges we see especially in cities that are developing very fast, is that because there's so much real estate construction, a lot of the urban greenery is being demolished. So a lot of trees where outdoor workers, and particularly those that are most vulnerable, would usually go to get shelter from these kinds of extreme temperatures, these spaces are no longer available for them. And so the city is also getting hotter as a result of that, that lack of green space. That's one. I mean, another one, if that is very effective, is ventilation. So the ability to be able to allow for ventilation within a built environment, whether that is through having windows that are open or windows that allow for cross ventilation within a built space. It's the same thing that the fan does for us, right? It allows us to provide some form of ventilation and a reduction in the temperature of the human body because of that airspeed that's hitting it. So allowing for ventilation and for shading are really important, especially from a building's point of view.
Thank you, Radhika. And of course, passive cooling is enabling us to avoid the additional use of energy that all of those extra air conditioners are going to require. Thank you so much for your answer. And I'm interested actually to hear whether our guests have questions for each other. Um, so, Radhika, do you have any questions for Angélica about her work in Colombia?
Yeah, I really admire all the work that you're doing, Angelica, in Colombia, and I think one of the things I'm wondering about is how do you have those difficult conversations? You know, the work you're doing at the Green Building Council is it requires bringing real estate developers in the room, you know, who I imagine just want to get their construction off the ground. But you're asking something else of them, which is to say, you know, you want them to build to a particular standard. And, you know, I imagine that there are times where that's not aligned with their own goals. So how are you, you know, what's helpful in those tough conversations?
Okay, several things. First, we have been trying to work with the different developers to build like a strategy towards sustainability, and I think that that's something important. So they don't see sustainability as something different, but more like something that is helping also their business. We have been working very hard also with financial institutions, you know, because I think that that's important for developers. That's important to have, you know, like financial, yeah, like information, and also, you know, like funds to develop what they're doing. So that's something that is important, but also it's an important work with the government to build public policy, because that's the way to move, you know, like all the different stakeholders, because at this point there are like some leaders that are doing, you know, like green buildings or green projects, but we need like everyone to do that. So the work in policy is also very important. But I think it's important to work with financial institutions, with policy makers, because that, but also I think also developers want always to do like the right thing, and that's also what we always tell them they should be doing. So it's to you know to have this conversation in all these different directions with them.
Thanks, Angelica. Yeah, I mean, as you say, you know, quite apart from anything else, informing these stakeholders that sustainability is good for business and has to be a key component of getting these messages across. After all, if it's not sustainable, it will not be sustained, is the old phrase. And so I wondered, Angelica, do you have any questions for Radhika?
Yeah, yes, Dave, and I think, and it's in the same way, like from your experience, the work that you've done in Asia, um, how do you handle, you know, to work like with the public sector and with the private sector, understanding that is important what happens in terms of urban development at the city level, but also what each different project can bring to the table. So what's your experience, and yeah, what suggestions do you have in that sense?
Yeah, I think you know the most successful examples I've seen are when you have a coalition of actors who have come together and are determined to move the agenda forward. And so it does require, you know, some form of leadership, like you have a policy entrepreneur somewhere, you know, who says, look, I'm going to care about setting a heat action plan in my district or in my locality or my city, you know, and really be the champion for that cause. I think it's very hard to do this without certain champions, but you need champions not just in one sphere. So just having somebody in policy is not enough. You know, it then requires a whole sort of village in some sense to come together, right? Um, Often when I did this work in India more than a decade ago, we were building South Asia's first heat action plan in the city of Ahmedabad, and you know, it was an incredible group of public health officials, of government policymakers, of academics, of non-profit organizations, of environmental groups, of hospitals, all of whom had, certain champions within them who agreed to come together and push the agenda forward. Also, the Met department was involved because they were doing the predictions of temperature. So I think it is, it's not easy to get that mix of people together in the room, but being able to find the folks who will really carry this issue forward, and then to create a plan that is locally relevant. I think it's very dangerous to just sort of do a cut, copy, paste of different, plans from different cities and try and implement them elsewhere. I think that doesn't work well. It works well when something is, a policy and a strategy and a plan is really embedded in local realities and is informed by the communities that are going to be affected by it. And so in a way, what I'm saying is, you can't do this quickly. You can't just turn this around overnight, but it's worth putting in the time and doing it in a manner that is inclusive of everybody who is going to be affected.
Fantastic. Thank you, Radhika. And now, I'm sorry to say, we're out of time. Thank you so much to our expert guests, Radhika Khosla and Angélica Ospina. You can check out more of their work at the links in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe to our channel, Climate Futures, and please do share it far and wide. I'm Dave Vetter, and our series producer is Liliana Resend. Climate Futures is brought to you by the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment and Oxford Digital Media. I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.